My name is Claire Arre. I am the Marine Restoration Director for Orange County Coastkeeper, and I am going to be the moderator for the Platform Biology and Impacted Wildlife panel. I'd like to invite my panelists up, if you come sit with me. I swear I don't smell. They just want to sit far away. It's okay. So I would like to give a moment to each of my panelists to be able to introduce themselves. So first off, Miss Debbie McGuire, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I get to start. Oh boy. Good morning, everybody. I'm Debbie McGuire with the Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center. I'm the executive director. And we are a nonprofit that was founded actually 50 years ago. This is our 50th anniversary. We were first known as the Alliance for Wildlife Rehabilitation and Education, and rehabilitated wildlife out of the Board of Education, Orange County Board of Education up in Orange. And then we had kind of in 89-90 lost that site, and we were looking for another site. And in 1990, the American Trader oil spill happened. And that was February 7th. I'm sure a lot of us in here remember that. So that's what brought me into this project. We met up with the Huntington Beach Wetlands Conservancy and Southern California Edison and got the land that we are at now at the corner of Pacific Coast Highway in Newland and Huntington Beach. We were the very first licensed wildlife rehabilitation center in the state of California in 1972 as the AWARE. So we're kind of proud of that. That's when they first started licensing people. So we were Alliance A, so I think that's why we got #1, but it didn't matter. So, at that point, when that oil spill happened, there was no governance to really know what to do with the wildlife. We were just handed gloves, and a few of you I know were here. We just walked out and picked up oiled wildlife and nowhere to take them. So at first we took them to a junior lifeguard station in Huntington Beach and realized there was no hot water or it wasn't heated, so that wasn't a good place. And then we found Chevron gave us a site over in Long Beach that we could set up so we could wash the oiled birds. Long story short, that oil spill made a lot of you get together at the Limpert Sea Strand, or Limpert-Keene Sea Strand Act of 1990, and that act made it possible for the state of California, under California Department of Fish and Wildlife, to develop OSPR, Oil Spill Prevention and Response. And then OSPR then had to figure out what are they going to do with the wildlife. So a few years later, there was another bill, the Watson bill, that helped them put together the Oiled Wildlife Care Network. And the Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center was the second purpose-built center built in the state of California. There's 10 of them now, from Humboldt all the way down to San Diego. So it's pretty nice that we drill all the time. We're ready 24/7 to respond to oil spills. We just hope they don't happen. And there's been quite a few, as you know. Some are smaller, some are inland. And then along in 2021, we had the pipeline spill. So we activated the whole center, which is run out of UC Davis Veterinary School, and our executive director is Dr. Michael Zaccardi. So OSPR activated the Oiled Wildlife Care Center, and then we were able to respond. So otherwise, we're just a 501c3 nonprofit staying open by donations from the public. So we're not getting money from the government to stay open. So thank you for letting me be here today, and if you have any questions, be sure to direct them to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Next, we'll have Dr. Jeremy Claisse introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Claisse. I'm associate professor at Cal Poly Pomona. I'm a marine ecologist focusing on fish. Outside of platforms, I work on fish life history, marine protected areas here in Southern California, reef restoration projects. We just been working on this big project off of Palos Verdes, restoring the rocky reef there. And for about a decade, or a little over a decade now, I've worked on fish living on the oil platforms as habitat. It's a big collaborative project building off of the work that Milton Love and others have done, collecting this big, I guess now 25-year data set, going down in summaries on the oil platforms and counting and sizing the fish. And about a decade ago, Milton, and with some funding from BOEM, Ann Bull was at BOEM at that time, came to me and Dr. Dan Pondella from Occidental College to try to use that data to estimate fish production on the platform. So fish production is basically how much weight is being produced, how much new growth of fish. And so we took their 20-year data set, we took probably over 100 other studies that looked at fish growth rates, mortality rates, and were able to calculate production for each species and for all the fish on these platforms using this big data set, and came to the conclusion that this was the most productive system that's been studied, similar to coral reefs and estuaries and other fish habitats that are known to be really productive. In the meantime, we've done studies looking at if they did do the partial removal, so cut off the top 85 feet of the platforms, how much of that production would be retained. It's basically 80 to 90% on most of the platforms, the bigger ones especially. We've looked at calculating reproductive output estimates, so how many eggs and larvae are produced, and found that for some of the platforms, for some species, there's 10 to 100 times, or I guess in one case, 600 times more reproductive output for one species on a given platform. And there's about 15 species of mostly rockfish that have really high production or reproductive output on the platforms. And yeah, I guess that about sums it up. We currently now are funded by BOEM to look at other types of sort of fill in the gaps, looking at fish on the pipelines, other artificial reefs. And this is a grant provided through Southern California Marine Institute in collaboration with Dan Pondella at Occidental College and myself and our students and staff. So we're going out and actively surveying the fish and using side scan to quantify the habitat on these other types of infrastructure that are out there to kind of get a broader picture of how the oil platform production fits in with the other type of habitats that are out there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. And last but not least, Dr. Chris Lowe.
So I'm a professor at Cal State Long Beach in marine biology, and I run the shark lab there. And the shark lab's been around since 1966, and we study more than sharks. So I've worked with Tom Raftkin. We've done a lot of work on game fish. And in the early days, there was no funding to study sharks, so we were mainly doing fish work. And it was about 15 years ago that BOEM came and said, we're really interested in trying to figure out what fish do on platforms. There were people doing lots of counting and figuring out what species were there and how many were there, but they didn't even know if they stayed. So one of the things the Shark Lab specializes in is the use of various types of technology to basically spy on fish. So we would use acoustic telemetry where we could go and tag fish on these platforms. And originally we started working in the Santa Barbara Channel, where a majority of the fish associated with those platforms were rockfish, as Amber was pointing out. And by tagging them and monitoring them, we figured out that some fish, some rockfish, will actually start at their smaller life stages at shallower platforms and then migrate to deeper platforms as they aged. And that showed that, not all platforms perform the same and therefore may not have the same ecological value or the same reefing value. And then, of course, one of the concerns was if you're going to decommission a platform, that requires quite often dropping charges down the jacket legs to blow them up and separate them from the seafloor. And of course, when you do that, anything with a swim bladder is killed within a kilometer of that range. So one of our studies that we did, which was really kind of fun, is we took rockfish off platforms in the Santa Barbara Channel and translocated them to a marine protected area at Anacapa. And the question is, could we take enough fish off a platform that could be decommissioned, that you could save some of that valuable stock? So the question is, we move them there, would they turn around and come back? And the problem was, over 25% of the fish that we took off the platform traveled 8 miles across the channel, turned around and came back to the platform from which we caught them sometimes within less than 2 weeks. So that actually brought about a really interesting finding, which was maybe platforms serve as better habitat quality for the fish than natural reef habitats. So we even did a little side experiment where we took rockfish off a natural reef and put them on the platform, and took the fish off the platform and put them on a natural reef. And the ones that we took off natural reefs and put on the platforms never went back. So, initially I was a little skeptical, but because all the work I had done had been studying the movements of fish and behavior of fish on natural reefs. And this was the first time I had really worked on an artificial reef. And I was actually astounded at the changes or differences in behaviors that we saw with fish associated with platforms compared to that with natural reefs. And we've done a lot of work on natural-made natural reefs, like the Wheeler North Natural Reef, or the artificial reef. And that behavior is basically what you would expect to see on a natural reef. So one of the things that we did next was we started working on the platforms off Long Beach and Huntington Beach. And we did many years of dive surveys and telemetry there, and basically found that the rockfish drop out there, and predominantly you get nearshore reef fish that you'd find at Catalina. So sheephead, camazon, many of those species are now using the platforms, even though they're sometimes deeper than you would expect to find at Catalina. And they would actually use the platform like a high-rise building. So they would move up and down in the water column as the seasons would change with water temperature. So by using telemetry and putting temperature and depth sensors in them, we're able to record their movements over the course of a year. And we also had a really nice experiment where they hydroclean the platforms. They knock off all the barnacles and all the mussels, and found that many of the fish that were associated with that platform left. But within 6 months, many of those marine invertebrates recovered, started to come back, and many of the fish returned back to the platform. So this, again, these behaviors that we were looking at showed us kind of something about the ecological importance of platforms. And now I thought I was out of the platform research business. We just started a study with some colleagues in Qatar, and they have offshore platforms there, and they're looking at a reefing program there. So they're working with some of the oil companies that have some of their platforms, and we're doing very similar approaches. We're going to tag fish there and ask, how are they using those platforms? Those platforms are 60 miles offshore, but their maximum depth is about 60 feet. And the Persian Gulf is very interesting because in the summer, surface water temperatures can exceed 98 degrees. So the question is, how do those fish even survive on those platforms?
Thank you so much, Chris. So as the first panel, many of you probably know, but these questions were submitted by the public as points of concern. So any questions that were asked in similar contexts multiple times are definitely questions that I'd like to ask my panelists today. But if you do have any other questions, there are little index cards on your tables. Please ask away, and we will try to get them answered for you by the end of the day. Okay, so my first question, we have heard a little bit about this, but to ask it specifically, what are the most common organisms on the rigs? Do these rigs support any commercially important species? Do the rigs support any endangered species? As well as, do these rigs endanger any species? Would any of you like to start first? Jeremy?
So invertebrates are the most common. Encrusting invertebrates, mussels, anemones. That's not what I study. But those, the reefs are covered with invertebrates. As you go down deeper, there's less and less. The top 50 feet or 50 to 100 feet, probably tons of mussels. People used to harvest mussels off a couple of the platforms in Santa Barbara area. I don't think that's going on anymore, but they used to harvest them and then sell them commercially at one point, or I think for food and for bait. In terms of fish, there are rockfish are the most common. As Chris mentioned, in the shallow part, maybe the top 100 feet, you get the suite of fish that are found on nearshore rocky reefs. But for the bigger platforms, most of the platform is rockfish are occupying the habitat as you go. And about 90% of the total fish on the platforms, across all the platforms, are rockfishes. Many are commercially important, some cases overfished, sort of partially protected species like boccaccio, lingcod, widow rockfish, copper rockfish, vermilion rockfish. And in terms of the production that we studied, how much growth of fish, Boccaccio and lingcod were two of the top four. So two of the most productive fish on the platforms are very important commercial species.
Yeah, so much of what Jeremy was saying, we see this shift in fish assemblages as you go from the north, which is predominantly rockfish, and many of them are commercially or recreationally important. And then, of course, as you move south, you start to see that transition away from some of the rockfishes and towards some of the more nearshore species that we would find, like I said, at Catalina or along our coast. So the rockfishes become less predominant on these platforms here. What was really interesting when we started some of this work, many of you might remember in 1999, there was even talk about listing Boccaccio as an endangered species because their stock had fallen below 20% of their virgin biomass. And of course, in 1999, we had probably one of the best recruitment events that we had seen in rockfish in many, many years. So I can remember tagging a lot of Boccaccio on those northern platforms at that time, when at the same time there was a big discussion about Boccaccio are gone. So the point that Amber made is a really important one. In many ways, these platforms do not get fished like they do in the Gulf. So therefore, they are acting, as Milton Love would say, as de facto marine reserves, and probably provided the source spawn for that recovery of Boccaccio at that time. So, I mean, we were catching probably every single drop was a Boccaccio, and it was in that anywhere from 10 to 12 inch range. So we were able to see some of that pattern, especially fishing those platforms as opposed to natural reefs. But in addition, we have had giant sea bass go by platforms. We detect them there. There are a number of other species that are passing by. I wouldn't say they're making residencies there, but we have caught cow cod there, yellow eye, those sorts of species, which are, some of those populations are still slowly recovering.
That's great. It's great to hear. Debbie, did you want any?
No.
Fair enough. Well, good, because the next question is mostly directed to you.
Oh.
So what does an oil spill, like the October Amplify spill, cost to the animals? Do cleanup funds cover both the costs short and long term? Do they cover any animal rehab costs?
Okay, that's a really good question. As far as what it costs to the animal or the bird, they're oiled, so that's a toxin. It's going to cause some GI issues. If the western snowy plover is a threatened species that was impacted with this last spill, and we have found in research that after an oiling, these birds don't usually clutch or have lay any eggs for the following year. So that's a huge problem for a threatened species when every individual is very important. So the ones that were oiled, 7 of them that were all released, will not be having active nests. The other question was
just the overall costs to the animals, and does any financial help come for animal rehab?
Okay, so there is natural resource, or NRDA, Natural Resources Disaster Assessment. Is that correct? I see fishing game over there.
Natural Resource Damage Assessment.
Assessment. Sorry, I forgot that.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's federal and state agencies that get together and they'll decide the costs. And those costs have to go through litigation, so the responsible party will eventually pay for all that. But in the meantime, the Oiled Wildlife Care Network and OSPR has a fund that they can activate the centers. So each center up and down the state, there's 10 of them, will get a certain fee to activate, and then each staff member has a certain amount that they'll get reimbursed. So us as the Wetlands and Wildlife Care Center, we paid our staff, but we will eventually get reimbursed once it goes through court. So for instance, for American Trader, it took 7 years for us to get any money back. So it's not like you get it instantly. So that's why we're very grateful that there is OSPR and OWCN that can support and get it all going, because they take it over. We have equipment ready all up and down the state. We have the Tyvek suits, the nitrile gloves, all the personal protective equipment that our staff needs. We have Dawn, We do wash the birds with Dawn dishwashing soap. Our centers are all built so that we have warm, soft water to be able to wash the birds. And it's a process too. It's not, we had some people that had collected a bird and tried to wash it with Dawn in their bathtub, and that bird ended up dying because we have to stabilize them first. And then once they're stable enough, we wash them, and it's tubs and tubs of water to get them washed. And then once that's completed, we have to rinse all that soap off of them, dry them, and then help them recondition to get their natural oils from their uropesial gland back on their feathers so that they can become waterproof again. So then after it's not just wash and be able to put them back out. It's a process that we go through, and it's time consuming, and the birds will be with us for a while. So does that answer all the questions, I think?
I think so too.
All right.
Would either of you gentlemen like to chime in?
That's okay.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to really care for each individual oiled animal that comes in. And thank you for warning us that it's not something that each individual person can do.
Yes. Please don't try it at home.
So my next question, what viable alternatives could we consider instead of removal? Have we explored in detail the benefits to both the people and the animal kingdom in utilizing these structures for alternative energies, mariculture of seafood, or anything else?
Well, the most discussed sort of viable alternative is partially removing the top part of the platform and leaving the rest to function as artificial reef. Potentially, the top part of that platform could be placed down next to the bottom of the platform, and this would continue to provide the same benefits in terms of producing fish, providing homes for adult fish to produce eggs and larvae, and which potentially could seed other areas, providing fishing opportunities both at the platforms or in surrounding natural reef areas. And so that's kind of the main discussed option. These other options, I've heard people discuss more recently, really outside of the area of my expertise in terms of potentially using them as anchoring points for farms, mariculture farms, or testing places for alternative energy. I can't really comment on the viability of that. I mean, what I've heard that engineers and industry representatives talk about is, the platforms themselves can potentially last I've heard up as much as 400 years if they're just left as is. But there's kind of a difference if you have all the weight of the top side and the upper parts that all that base needs to support. If that's all removed, the platform can sit there for a long time, but it becomes a different scenario once you have the liability of people being on top of those platforms. And maybe experts will talk more about that today.
Yeah, I would say from a fish behavior standpoint, leaving a platform intact, providing that shade makes a big difference in terms of schooling species, right? So anchovy sardines are using that as kind of a shadow that protects them from predators. And that's probably factoring into some of that productivity. But the cost of maintaining that, as Jeremy was pointing out, could be really cost prohibitive. And of course, there's a liability to maintaining that. Ecologically, it is probably more beneficial to have that shaded structure there. You probably will lose some of that productivity if you do that. And the other thing is, what I think makes these platforms so unique ecologically is the fact that they act like pinnacles. They act like islands, except a hollow island, which means they increase the amount of surface area that's available. If you cut that off and you turn it into a seamount, it won't have that same level of productivity. And I suspect a lot of larvae that are in the water column right at the surface bump into those platforms, and then that divines them down towards the bottom. And that's why I kind of refer to them as kind of high-rise buildings for fish. So if you start looking at those alternatives of leaving a platform intact and leaving the top on it, you don't have to have the whole structure on top. You could just leave a platform. It could be used for nesting birds or testing new technologies. I think there may be some platforms that would be better for using in that reef opportunity as opposed to cutting and then placing next to those. So I think, as Amber pointed out, we know that pretty much every single platform has different communities associated with it and may have different ecological benefits. And I think those would have to be considered on a case-by-case basis.
I go with what they said.
So my next question, is there a way in which to repurpose or potentially recycle the platform in its components to this oil rig? You had mentioned that there might be some benefits to keeping a platform for birds, but there are any other repurposed ideas that you've come across and think are viable?
So one of the interesting phenomenon for rockfish living on these species is they tend to recruit or come in out of their planktonic larval stage to the upper portions of the platform. And upper for rockfish probably means maybe 50 to 150, 200 feet down. And then in general for rockfish, as they get larger, they tend to move deeper. So on a platform, that means the youngest ones are living up on the structure, and then they're slowly moving down. For a Boccaccio, for example, probably for a deeper platform over 2, 3, 4, 5 years. If the platform, the bottom depth at the seafloor is in the right preferred habitat for adult Boccaccio, for example, a lot of them will remain at the base of that platform. And at those platforms, you see a lot of adult reproductive Boccaccio, high densities at the base of the platform. If it's shallower, they'll most likely move to natural reefs in deeper waters. So the base of those platforms are really productive for a lot of species. So one idea I've heard is removing either the top side, building infrastructure, or that top part of the platform if they are partially moved, and putting those down at the base. And that would save having to bring them on shore, having to find a place to process them. When that was tried in California 30 years ago, it was kind of a smell disaster. From what I understand, I wasn't there in LA Harbor when they brought the original platforms in. Or now we've heard they have to be taken probably to other countries to deal with them. So reusing them as sort of reef habitat may be an alternative to consider.
Debbie, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, having worked on platforms for 10 years, my dream was what an amazing marine lab that would make. When you think of the cost of putting something like that out on the ocean, or the amount of money we spend in ship time to do oceanic work. We have some platforms that are literally in 700 feet of water right off Huntington Beach, which means they're easily accessible. They have telecommunication, they have power associated with them. So in many ways, to pull that structure out would really, be a shame, because you have the ability to do some incredible research, not just in marine science, but also developing new ocean types of technology and testing it, where the costs of doing that are pretty exorbitant. So the fact that you have pipelines coming in means you have the ability to bring in cables, all sorts of things that we're trying to transition to more renewable sources of energy. So in many ways, it would be great to see some of these platforms retained for that purpose only. But of course, those are very expensive endeavors. But nonetheless, if you ever tried to do that for the purpose of research, think of the cost.
I think that's a great idea. I think we do need more research, and that is a great way to reuse these platforms. And I'm waiting to see the two of you out there running one of those, right?
I could see a Cal State Marine Lab.
I see it.
So we've slightly touched on this topic, discussing how productive the overall jacket, the upward portion of the rig. But are there any other biologically important sections? Are the wells important? Are the pipelines themselves important? When removing and decommissioning those rigs, would removing those components also affect the biodiversity?
So, removing a whole platform would for sure affect the biodiversity that was there. As Chris mentioned, if they use the charges as they do in the Gulf of Mexico, the pressure wave would kill most of the fish in the area. the invertebrates attached there, you would lose. And I think it's always important to not just think about, the fish that happen to be there at the one time, a snapshot in time, but the decades and decades of potential productivity of fish recruiting there, and either remaining there or moving to nearshore reefs that you would lose. In general, as I kind of briefly mentioned, this phenomena of fish recruiting and the youngest fish being up in the water column in the structure as it's up away from the bottom and kind of providing a nursery habitat, and then moving down to the base of the habitat where you have the big adults. That's where a lot of the big sort of adolescent fish are. You have the highest productivity rates, but the shell mounds surrounding the platform, so there's the mussels that are up at the surface, attached to the platform. As those fall off or are washed off, they create these big acres and acres of shell mounds that others have studied and found that those are important habitats for juvenile fish. And lingcod, for example, they'll have a lot of juvenile lingcod in those shell mound habitats. And these can be acres and acres of piles of shells, tens of feet tall, will occupy there, and then the adults will move in closer to the base of the more complex base structure of the platform. Milton Love's group has studied, there's one study so far that's looked at the pipelines, the one that connects Gale and Grace off of Ventura. They found, high, 7 or 8 times as many fish on those pipeline habitats at the seafloor compared to soft bottom habitats in the area. And some important species like cowcod, juvenile vermilion rockfish were there. We'll hopefully look at and find similar sort of patterns at the platforms, or at the pipelines here in Southern California, off Long Beach area. But those can be potentially important habitats.
Yeah, I agree with Jeremy. There's not a lot of work done looking at the function or the value of many of those pipelines, with the exception of the few studies that Milton's done. But from a behavior standpoint, think of those things acting as roads. So fish are moving along the coastline looking for new habitat. They bump into one of these. It has high relief. It has encrusting organisms on it. It becomes shelter. And then you can imagine them moving along that would lead them to a platform. So in many ways, this could be a way some of the nearshore reef fish actually find some of our platforms offshore. So for some animals, they actually might be orientation devices as they're migrating along the coast. They kind of know where they are because they're encountering objects that they recognize and know where they are. So obviously some of those things could be removed. Those that emerge above the seafloor are providing habitat in a sandy oasis that there is no other habitat, and there's no doubt that there'll be species associated with those. And if you remove them, those species will have to find some other place to live.
Just to touch on it, what about our charismatic megafauna? About our sea lions, our whales? How are they impacted by both the oil rigs and potentially impacted by the decommissioning process?
Yeah. So having
We're talking to fish people, sorry.
Yeah. Having dove
Yes,
on all
and
the
birds.
platforms, there are lots of sea lions. In fact, NOAA did a study a few years ago trying to characterize the importance of the platforms for the pinniped community, so seals, sea lions, and basically found that, they're all kind of different. Sea lions are predominantly using the platforms because they're the few that can jump high enough to get onto the lower catwalks or some of the cross members, and are using it even for nursing. So they've actually seen nursing females out there. During our dives, when you got schools of anchovies or sardines, they're constantly dive bombing you. So they're definitely foraging within the structure and using that. And sometimes there are so many on the catwalks that the workers can't, they have to shoo them off to actually walk along. So they're clearly being used as important habitat. Obviously, if you remove that, they will find someplace else to go, maybe one of your boats out here in the marina, which may not be a good alternative. In terms of whales, sharks, things like that, we worked with many of the oil platform operators, who are on the platforms all the time, and they would tell us, of course, we see white sharks out here, we see blue sharks, we see mako sharks, and they are feeding on and around the fish that are associated with the platforms, but they don't stay. There's not enough for them to really stay. As I mentioned before, giant sea bass are probably using those things, but not staying. They'll go there, feed for a bit, and then move somewhere else. So I think they become, stations that animals may pass by. Obviously they'll see gray whales and things like that pass by, but they probably, other than some orientation device, probably don't serve that great of ecological function for them, except for the seals and sea lions.
Great. And now maybe one of the more pressing questions of the day. If you were able to speak for these organisms that inhabit these rigs, what would their concerns be for decommissioning? As scientists, is there anything that you feel like that is missing from this decommissioning conversation? If you could direct the decommissioners, what would you tell them?
Multiple parts to that question. So, the
I can break
fish
it
and
down.
invertebrates don't realize this is an oil platform. They think it's a hard structure, a rock that they're sheltering in and around. So I would assume they would be kind of upset if you took away their home. I think part of the law here in California about the rigs to reef law was you need to show a net benefit to the environment as part of that. And each platform should be evaluated on its own. I think for many platforms, we've definitely crossed that net benefit role in terms of fish habitat. Another way to look at it would be remove that these are oil platforms. If these were natural habitats, pinnacle reefs, and we had done studies showing they were the most productive habitats that we've studied, really important for some species for reproductive output, and there was some law or some company proposing to remove them for a mining operation or something. That would be more than enough to stop anything like that from happening, in terms of a scientific bar of showing these are important habitats. We haven't quite got to fully understanding the regional impacts of fisheries for these, and that's kind of what we're working on next. But in terms of being, in their own right, important habitats in the local area, I think we've definitely gotten there for many species that we understand.
Yeah, I keep coming back to the first time I dove a platform, I was very skeptical, and I thought, those things, once they're done, they should pull them out. It's the steel structure. And it wasn't until I dove them for the first time and I saw how much life was on them compared to what I see on a natural reef that I was actually pretty astounded. And the amount of fish biomass there is just mind-boggling. And that's what is accessible via diver depth. So for a person who's worked on artificial reefs where there's sand and nothing there, and you can characterize that there's nothing there, and then you put a rock down within a day, there'll be a kelp bass on that, literally within a day. And then, of course, these platforms have been off our shores for almost 60 years in some places. So they are structure. They are home. And what makes them, I think, particularly unique is many of their locations offshore and what surrounds them, which is usually nothing, sand. So it literally becomes this oasis. And as Jeremy pointed out, we really don't fully understand or appreciate the degree at which they're contributing to our overall fisheries. And some of the places that have been overfished, that have now been protected and coming back, how much are they contributing to that success? So I think those are things that we really have to think about. And again, we have to assess each platform independently because they all function differently.
Debbie, would you like to contribute?
No, I think that an ecosystem that sounds, I cannot wait for the virtual reality reef dive, because I think we'll all see how vital and vibrant this ecosystem is and how important it would be to keep it and not take it away.
Well, that is the conclusion of our section. I do want to thank again our panelists. We are very excited about the virtual reality. I think that'll be a fun lunchtime and happy hour. So if you have not been under the water at a platform, definitely check that out. But thank you.